the lost river of gold. Still to this day, I want to kick myself for my own ignorance, hindsight being 20/20. Sure, over the centuries there have been plenty of stories told about talking fish. And I would have disregarded this one as myth if the myth hadn't happened to me personally. Regrettably, this true tale is about how I lost $100 million in gold by being impatient and not listening while fishing. The terrible mishap occurred on my first trip to Alaska. We'd flown into a remote part of the Nushagak River. Cooper, Baker, and I were there for the king salmon run and arrived on June 21st, the summer equinox. The fishing had been great. With the sun never far below the horizon, we could fish until too fatigued to make one last cast. We camped on the riverbank, hundreds of miles from the nearest road, and the kings were moving upstream by the thousands. It would have been a perfect trip except for my mistake. Now I can only wish the memory wasn't so abundantly clear. My bad luck event started on a chilly morning. Rising well before my companions, I found the river bathed in a thick, eerie fog. Heading upriver on foot, I felt sure I'd latch onto something big. Knowing the region was thick with grizzly bear and cantankerous moose, I was undaunted, glad for the solitude, and in awe of the spectacular wilderness. After marching several hard miles, I came to a promising spot. The river braided into several smaller channels, and it seemed the perfect location to hook into a 60-pound king moving upriver to spawn. Throwing a big streamer, I set to working the river with confidence. However, after over an hour of serious fishing, I hadn't had a single strike. By then I knew the coffee would be brewing back at camp, and decided it was time for breakfast, and one last cast. Stripping my line in, my fly had almost reached shore when suddenly a fish lunged out from under the bank and hit my fly. In the clear water, I saw it wasn't a very large fish and was surprised a fish no more than 15 inches long would gulp down such a large salmon fly. Nevertheless, the little thing was tenacious, and it took me longer than I cared to admit to land the prize. When I finally got fish into the shallows, I saw it was the strangest-looking fish I'd ever seen. As I said, it was only 15 inches long, but it had a dorsal fin almost as large. It was tan and gray, with brilliant fluorescent blue spots. Having only seen pictures, I suddenly realized I'd just caught my first Arctic grayling. Excited, I left the fish on line in the water and examined the tiny wonder. It was the most beautiful thing I ever had seen. It was magical, nothing less than enchanting. And although it had put up a tremendous fight, up close the little fish seemed frail and somehow precious. Feeling it would be a sin against Mother Nature herself if I were to cause this rare and beautiful living creature any further harm, I gently lifted the strange surprise out of the water. That's when the grayling started singing. I have heard the croaks a big brown trout makes when you squeeze too hard while removing a hook. I have even heard of laughing bass in Venezuela that cackle when out of the water. But never have I ever heard anything like the voice of this grayling. Curious, rather than pull the hook out right away, I carefully put the exhausted fish back in the water, and I reached in my vest for my camera and my dictaphone. The noise the fish was making was so interesting I wanted to record it. Once I was ready, I delicately lifted the fish from the water a second time and removed the hook. I then gently laid the grayling in the palm of my hand, snapped a picture, and turned on my tape recorder. The fish squirmed onto its belly and I swear it was trying to look me square in the eye. Then the grayling started singing the same song again in a melodious whisper. It was the strangest thing I'd ever heard. I looked in wonder and listened in wonder to its distinct and diverse chorus for some time, recording all the while. I took another quick snapshot, and then, smiling at the rare little living gem, I carefully lowered the precious little fish back into the river, interrupting its song in a gurgle. Curiously, the fish only swam a foot away, stopped, looked back at me, where I swear it seemed to shrug. It then turned and disappeared into the shade of the bank from which it had come. The experience left me with a feeling of triumph as I cheerfully headed back to camp breakfast. Back at the tents, the rich smells of coffee and bacon took over my thoughts, and it wasn't until the middle of my second helping of eggs before I mentioned the grayling and its song. As I told the story, our guide looked at me with suspicion and said he'd never heard any graylings ever make a peep, emphasizing he had caught hundreds over the years. Well, I had evidence, so I took out my little cassette player, rewound the tape, and played back my singing fish recording. Everyone around the table just stared at the tape player, forks half raised, gawking as they listened to the lyrics. None had heard anything like it before. After the tape ended at the gurgle, there was a long silence before everyone started laughing. Somehow, they all assumed the recording was another one of my elaborate pranks, my reputation for tall tales and practical jokes once again preceding me. No one believed my story, and during the rest of the trip, everyone made jokes about my singing fish. Every time one of my companions landed a fish, they'd start singing some popular tune like, "Roxanne, you don't have to put on the red dress," or, "Wake up, Maggie, I think I got something to say to you," until everyone but myself was laughing hysterically. By the end of the trip, I too was smiling at the antics, but still felt there was something more to the grayling mystery. After the trip, it was some time before the subject of my singing fish came up again. When it did, I was giving a small dinner party. My guests were the usual mixed crowd, friends and friends of friends. During the conversation, someone asked about my trip to Alaska, so brought out my photos. Most of the pictures were of me, or one of my companions, holding up a large king salmon or a smaller but still formidable silver. However, the picture that received the most attention was the photo of the small grayling sitting in my palm, with its mouth open. Naturally, I repeated my story, and couldn't resist bringing out my trusty dictaphone to play my singing fish evidence. To my surprise, when the recording ended, the date of a good friend said, "It may be Eskimo, perhaps a Yupik dialect, but my best guess would be the song is being sang in the Aleut language." Everyone, most of all myself, were stunned. The woman then continued in a confident academic voice, "Archaeologists have theorized that the Eskimo Aleuts migrated across the Bering Strait some 8 to 10,000 years ago. As they spread across the north, 3 distinct linguistic groups evolved. Eventually, these people inhabited the area from Prince William Sound in southern Alaska, all the way to eastern Greenland, and, although the Aleut Indians mainly populated their namesake islands, they were never a static people." My mouth dropped open and I had to ask, "You mean to say this recording is actually an old native dialect, sang by a fish?" Smiling, she replied, "I am relatively certain it's the Aleut language, but as for having been sung by a fish, I'd consider that highly improbable." Intrigued, I asked, "How could you possibly know it's the Aleut language?" I then learned the young woman was an archaeologist specializing in Native American cultures and languages in the Northwest. As luck would have it, she was in town from Washington, D.C., where she was an aide to an Alaskan senator, helping out on the numerous Native American issues in the state. At that point, I had to ask if it would be possible to have the strange recording translated. She nodded, saying her Aleut was a little rusty, but she knew an expert who would be able to get it done. Without hesitation, I gave her the cassette. She said it might take a few weeks, but she would get back to me as soon as possible. The evening ended with pleasant speculation. The saddest part of the saga happened several weeks later, when I finally received a response from that bright, charming young archaeologist. Her letter read as follows: "Dear friend, the tape you gave me is most extraordinary. My Alaskan colleague, an expert in ancient native languages, was absolutely astounded by your recording's content and wishes to know exactly where you obtained it. Apparently, the dialect used in the song is over 3,000 years old, and although the voice is very strange, the words were surprisingly clear and easily translated. I told my friend about your talking fish experience and was surprised that he didn't think it could possibly be a prank. He said, 'If this is a prank, someone really had to know a great deal about the ancient Aleut culture and language,' which he thought highly unlikely. Also, apparently, there are several folktales, still told today, about the Aleuts being able to speak with the wildlife. If this is a hoax, it's the best one in decades. Miraculously, your recording uses the same poetic structure as an ancient Aleut love song. Even more intriguing is the fact that the poem sang gives rather detailed directions to a specific location. The song is essentially an offer, or rather a trade, the singer's life in exchange for a fortune in gold. If the voice can be believed, there's a glacier near where the recording was made under which can be found a river-sized deposit of gold. Whomever was speaking used the time of year, celestial navigation points, and geographic references as directions to the treasure. Unfortunately, the recording was incomplete. The last lines, those which would have been the most important for actually finding the glacier's exact location, were drowned out in the sound of splashing water. However, the old dialect, the method of navigation, all point to a very reliable source. If you'd only recorded 1 or 2 more lines of the verse, you would have, in all likelihood, been able to accurately locate the glacier described, and perhaps find a river of gold not yet discovered. Below you will find the translation. Again, it is a shame you did not record just a few seconds more. Thank you for the interesting recording. Sincerely, your friend, North American Native Studies Institute. Translation, Dr. Raven. Source material, unknown. You have my breath. You have my bones. You have my flesh. These are a treasure to me. And a little to thee. Give me my life, and I will give you the river of gold. The glacier is blue. The glacier is cold. Deep beneath it lies the light of gold. It is not near. It is not far. The rising autumn sun is where you steer. The harvest moon tells you are near. In the shadow of the peak called Arblup Gurgle. End recording. After reading the letter, I sunk in my chair, put my head in my hands, and wept. I let that little grayling go before it finished telling me where a river of gold awaited. For years I have returned to that same place on the Nushagak, always hoping to catch another singing fish. I have caught many in the time since, and each time I do, I dream of princely riches. However, as hard as I have tried to coax and coerce the small lovely fishes to sing for me again, not one has ever uttered a single note. I've also spent hours examining maps, trying to speculate to which glacier the fish had referred. It could be the Columbian, the Valdez, the Miles, or the Stellar, but the country and distances are far too vast to guess. In the end, my only consolation is my treasury of the memories. In recollections, I am truly rich.